Let me tell you something that no one in Washington is saying out loud. The most powerful economy in modern history is making decisions right now that future historians will study the way we study the fall of Rome. Not because an enemy defeated it, because it defeated itself. And the most devastating part is that the weapon it used was supposed to be its greatest strength. The tariffs were sold as economic patriotism, protection for American workers, a wall of financial steel around American industry. The message was simple, powerful, and politically effective. We're going to make them pay. And the American public, tired of watching factories close and communities hollow out, wanted to believe it. I understand that. I genuinely do. But belief is not a business model. And the numbers, the real numbers that don't appear in campaign speeches, tell a story so different from the official narrative that when you see it clearly, all at once, it genuinely shocks you. Mexico is not paying. Mexico is winning, and America is building its own economic coffin, one tariff announcement at a time. Here is what you need to understand about how North American manufacturing actually worked before the disruption, because without this foundation, nothing else makes sense. For decades, the United States, Mexico, and Canada built something that had no real precedent in industrial history. Not a simple trade relationship where one country makes things and another buys them. An integrated production architecture so deeply interwoven that a single automobile component might cross the border between the US and Mexico multiple times during its manufacturing journey before it ever reached a consumer. Cast in Monterrey, machined in Michigan, returned south for electronics installation, shipped north again for final assembly. This was not inefficiency. This was the highest form of industrial optimization that capitalism had ever produced. Every stage happened where it could be done best, fastest, and most cheaply. The result was a manufacturing ecosystem that made American products globally competitive against European and Asian rivals who had their own advantages. Then the tariffs arrived. And here is the mathematical reality that no one in the administration wanted to calculate. When you impose a 25% tariff on a component that crosses the border multiple times during production, you're not taxing a foreign competitor once, you're taxing your own supply chain repeatedly. The cost stacks. It compounds. A vehicle that cost $30,000 to produce suddenly costs $40,000, and that difference does not disappear into thin air. It lands on the American family signing the financing papers at the dealership. Do you think American consumers fully understand that the price increases they're seeing right now are a direct result of tariff policy, not corporate greed? Tell me what you actually believe in the comments below. General Motors cannot simply move production back to Michigan. Ford cannot snap its fingers and recreate in Ohio what took 30 years to build in Saltillo. The specialized factories, the trained engineers, the supplier networks, the logistical infrastructure, all of that industrial tissue exists in Mexico. It does not exist in the American Midwest anymore. Those capabilities were not outsourced temporarily. They were relocated permanently, and the institutional knowledge that makes them function went with them. So what did Mexico do when the tariffs hit? Exactly what any rational actor with options does. It stopped waiting for the relationship to stabilize and started building alternatives. Volkswagen in Puebla restructured its export contracts to send engines directly to European and Asian assembly lines, completely bypassing the American production pipeline. Electronics assembly facilities in Tijuana that once sourced 80% of their components from American suppliers began importing aggressively from Korea and Taiwan. Within 18 months, several of those facilities had essentially flipped their entire sourcing model. The Americans who lost those supply contracts will not get them back. Long-term relationships in manufacturing do not restart like a subscription service. They transfer to competitors who stay reliable. There is a wire harness factory in Guanajuato that tells this story better than any economic report I could cite. 15,000 workers. Every single kilometer of cable it produced went to one customer, an American automaker. When the tariffs raised the cost of each harness by 35%, that factory did not close, it diversified. Within a year and a half, it had signed contracts with German, Korean, and Chinese manufacturers. The American customer went from 100% of its production to less than half. And when the American automaker eventually decided it wanted to restore that volume, the capacity had already been committed to others under long-term agreements. Gone. Permanently. Multiply that story by thousands of facilities across hundreds of industries, and you begin to understand that what is happening is not a negotiating posture, it is a permanent restructuring of how industrial production flows through the Western Hemisphere. Now let us talk about money, because this is where the story stops being about trade policy and becomes about something far more consequential. Between 2023 and 2024, Mexico attracted $68 billion in new foreign direct investment, not speculative money chasing short-term yields. Real capital building, real factories committing to real decades-long production cycles. The question worth asking is not how large the number is, but why rational global investors, people managing billions of dollars who have no political agenda, are choosing Mexico over the United States at this particular moment. Tesla announced a gigafactory in the Monterrey region with an initial investment of $5 billion. The official story was nearshoring, bringing production closer to American consumers. Read the actual planning documentation. Look at the vehicle models being designed for that facility, the price points, the target markets. That factory is not being built to serve American buyers. It is being built as a global export platform, producing affordable electric vehicles for Latin American markets, for Southeast Asian consumers, for European entry segments. Tesla is using Mexico to compete with the world, not to supply its neighbor. Samsung completed a $7 billion semiconductor facility in Querétaro. And then comes the detail that should genuinely alarm any American strategist paying attention. BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle company that has emerged as one of the most consequential industrial players on the planet, is building its first manufacturing facility outside Asia in the Mexican state of Durango. Think carefully about what that means. Chinese goods face significant American tariffs, but goods manufactured in Mexico carry a completely different trade status. By producing inside the North American geography, Chinese companies gain access to supply chains, logistics networks, and eventually market proximity that the tariff wall was specifically designed to block. The tariffs against China created a door. Mexico is that door. And instead of closing it, American trade policy built a welcome sign above it and left the key in the lock. Where are you watching this video from right now? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how wide this conversation is spreading. The executives making these investment decisions are not ideological people. They do not care about geopolitics, except insofar as geopolitics affects their return on capital. When I ask them why they choose Mexico over the United States, the answer I hear most consistently is not labor costs. It is not even access to markets, though that matters enormously. The answer is predictability. Mexico has been signing and honoring long-term trade agreements with remarkable consistency, 50 countries with open trading relationships. A manufacturing investor who builds in Mexico can access markets from Japan to the European Union to Chile to Colombia without tariff friction. An investor who builds in the United States faces barriers in markets that a Mexican manufactured competitor enters freely. But more than market access, what global capital values above almost everything is certainty about the rules. If a president can restructure decades of trade policy in a single announcement, if tariff rates can double between the time you commission a factory and the time it opens, if the regulatory environment is functionally unpredictable from one administration to the next, then the return on investment calculation for building in that country requires a risk premium that makes the numbers not work. Investors do not need to hate America to stop investing there. They just need the math to not work, and the math is increasingly not working. Mexico graduated 120,000 engineers in 2024. The United States graduated 180,000, but with a population 3 times larger. Adjust those numbers for per capita output, and you see a country closing the talent gap faster than most people realize. But the number that truly matters is not graduation rates, it is retention. Industrial engineer turnover in advanced Mexican manufacturing runs at roughly 8% per year. Comparable American facilities see rates approaching 25%. When your workforce stays, institutional knowledge accumulates. Quality improves, error rates fall. You develop something that cannot be purchased or replicated quickly, genuine operational mastery at scale. The aerospace clusters forming in Sonora and Baja California illustrate this perfectly. Honeywell, Safran, Bombardier are not moving simple bolt assembly operations to these regions. They are moving sophisticated manufacturing, turbine blades, composite fuselage structures, avionics systems, work that requires precision engineering, advanced materials science, and deeply trained human expertise. 20 years ago, this category of production was considered anchored in American facilities. Today, those American facilities have closed. The Mexican operations that replaced them have not just matched the capability. In some documented cases, they have exceeded it. Now I need to bring you to the part of this story that receives almost no coverage in American financial media. And it is the most important part, because everything we have discussed so far, the trade disruption, the investment migration, the manufacturing restructuring, all of that is a symptom. The underlying condition is the accelerating erosion of dollar supremacy. And this is where a trade policy mistake becomes a civilizational, strategic error. The dollar's power is not a natural phenomenon. It is a convention that has held for 80 years since the Bretton Woods agreements structured the post-war global order around American currency, because every country needed dollars to buy oil, to settle international contracts, to service external debt. The United States could run deficits that would destroy any other currency, print money that the world was structurally obligated to absorb, and use its financial system as a global enforcement mechanism. That power is absolute as long as every government on Earth continues choosing to participate in the dollar system. The moment a critical mass decides the cost of participation exceeds the benefit, the convention breaks. And the conventions of international finance, once broken, do not reassemble in their original form. Every time Washington freezes a country's foreign reserves, every time swift access is weaponized as a political tool, every time dollar-denominated transactions are blocked to punish a government for policy disagreements, the message delivered to every central bank holding dollar reserves is identical. Your savings are not actually yours. Your economic sovereignty is conditional on American approval. That message creates a rational incentive to reduce exposure. And Mexico, sitting on over $200 billion in reserves with the majority in American currency, hears that message at considerable volume. In 2024, Brazil and Mexico completed bilateral trade transactions settled entirely in their national currencies, oil sold from one state company to the other, payment in reais and pesos, $0 involved. This was not a dramatic geopolitical statement. It was a technical test, but tests become templates. That bilateral arrangement has expanded. Other regional partners are being brought into the same architecture. A regional settlement system is being constructed in Latin America, where the dollar is simply not a required participant. The China-Mexico trade corridor is where this becomes structurally critical. China is Mexico's second largest trading partner, with over $100 billion in annual bilateral commerce. A growing share of that commerce is settling in yuan. Chinese banks have opened Mexican offices offering yuan-denominated credit lines. Mexican Pacific ports are processing yuan payments for container shipments, and most significantly, Chinese infrastructure financing is arriving in Mexico, denominated in Chinese currency. Mexico is issuing debt in yuan. A country on America's southern border is building its sovereign financial architecture around the currency of America's primary strategic rival. Not out of hostility, out of rational risk management. Do you think the dollar will still be the world's dominant reserve currency in 20 years, or are we already past the point of no return? I want your honest answer in the comments. The mechanical consequences of this shift move through the American economy with brutal precision. As Mexico and its partners need fewer dollars for trade, they hold fewer dollars in reserve. As they hold fewer dollars, they buy fewer American Treasury securities. As Treasury demand falls, yields must rise to attract remaining buyers. As yields rise, the cost of servicing $36 trillion of American national debt increases. As debt service costs rise, they crowd out every other category of government spending. And this is not a theoretical future scenario. It is a feedback loop that is already operating. The digital infrastructure accelerating this transition deserves particular attention because it changes the timeline of everything. Mexico's central bank has completed technical trials of its central bank digital currency. The technical partner coordinating interoperability standards is the People's Bank of China. The two institutions are designing direct digital payment rails that allow instant settlement between peso and yuan without correspondent banks, without SWIFT messaging, without dollar conversion, and without generating any record visible to American financial surveillance systems. This is not a distant ambition. The engineering is already underway. When it is operational at scale, a Mexican manufacturer can pay a Chinese supplier instantly, at near zero cost, in a combined digital settlement that the American financial system has no ability to observe, intercept, or influence. Multiply that capability across dozens of country pairs and millions of daily transactions, and the dollar's structural role in global commerce is not replaced in a single dramatic crisis. It is quietly, incrementally, irreversibly reduced until the day when removing it entirely costs no one anything significant. The BRICS expansion means this pressure comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now joined by Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. The architecture being developed within this grouping is specifically designed to allow international commerce without any single nation's currency serving as the universal intermediary. The pitch to Mexico is uncomplicated and, from a Mexican perspective, genuinely attractive. Participate in a system where no one can freeze your reserves, where your trade is not subject to another country's political decisions, where you negotiate your own terms rather than inheriting someone else's. For a country that has spent 2 centuries in the economic shadow of its northern neighbor, this represents a structural shift in available choices that did not exist a generation ago. Here is the larger truth that all of this points toward, and I want to say it plainly because it tends to get lost in the technical detail. The United States is not being defeated. It is making choices, specific, avoidable, consequential choices that are systematically dismantling the mechanisms through which its economic power operates. The factories that were supposed to return to Michigan are instead being built in Monterrey and Querétaro. The workers who were supposed to benefit from protection are paying higher prices for goods produced in supply chains that no longer pass through their communities. The dollar that was supposed to be strengthened by assertive trade policy is being quietly stepped around by countries building alternative infrastructure. Every policy action producing the opposite of its stated intention. Every attempt to restore American economic dominance, accelerating the conditions for its decline. This is what strategic self-destruction looks like in real time. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a long series of decisions that each seem defensible in isolation and collectively represent a civilizational error. The world outside Washington is not waiting for American policy to clarify. The contracts are signed, the factories are under construction, the payment rails are being coded and tested, the trade agreements are in force and generating real transactions. Every month that this continues is another month of compounding, and compounding in the wrong direction does not reverse when someone in Washington eventually decides to change course. The counterparties have moved on. The infrastructure serves new purposes. The institutional relationships have formed around new anchors. History has been here before. Every empire that confused the appearance of strength with the substance of strategic wisdom eventually arrived at the same moment, looking at a world that had quietly reorganized while it was busy defending a position that no longer mattered, negotiating for access to systems it once controlled, on terms set by others, paying costs that accumulated from decisions it made freely and could have made differently. That moment is not coming. For America, in important respects, it is already here. The question is only whether enough people are willing to read the numbers honestly instead of the headlines comfortably. If this conversation reached you and made you think differently about what you thought you understood, share it with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want analysis that stays honest when honesty is inconvenient. And tell me in the comments, what do you think America should actually do right now to reverse this? Because that is the conversation we need to be having, and I don't see it happening anywhere near the people who have the power to act on it.